welcome everybody to episode 20 of The Walls Within. I know I can speak for Curtis. I don't think he or I expected to get this far into it when we started this project. Curtis, I think the initial number that we threw out was like, hey, we'll try to get like 4 of these thrown down and see where it goes. And,
yeah, I had 10 in my head.
Okay.
That 10 was like my number in my head, and I think that's because I had enough stories that I felt were worth sharing. But after that, I didn't know what I had left afterwards. And so I've been pleasantly surprised, like just in interviewing people and getting opportunities to speak with different individuals that have had different experiences.
Yeah.
And really just to kind of go down their journey.
Absolutely.
And explore that and get the opportunity to share that with our listeners.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun.
So we've thrown down over 18 hours of material. As Curtis mentioned, we've had some amazing guests that have helped us kind of on our path talking about Walls Within, elite performance, obstacles, just some awesome stories with really, really cool people. And so one of the things that I want to do first off is say thanks to anybody that is continuing to join us and listen. I know there's a core group of people that are still tuning in and checking us out. We're trying to grow the podcast. So talk about it, share it with your friends if you think it's compelling. And as always, we encourage interaction on our Instagram page and through our emails via the website. So if you've got ideas or you want to hit us up with questions, we can keep those private. We can share your information publicly here. All of that is fair game. And again, this is kind of a pretty free-flowing format. We have no producers. We have no staff. It's Curtis and I in our home offices, basements, working on this. And so it's just us. It's a grassroots kind of thing that we've started and we believe in. So what is episode 20? We are going to recap and we're going to kind of talk about where we've been with all of our guests, the things that have jumped out at us. And then after we go through all those episodes, we've had, Curtis, about 7, 8 different really compelling guests that we've had on. You've got the list there.
We've hosted 8 guests so far, and each of them have kind of brought their own unique story, journey, and a few just really insightful things that I think we've kind of just opened our eyes to a little bit in talking to them.
Yeah. So as you listen to this, if you're talking about this podcast, either in your business circles, athletic, sports circles, hockey circles, for the folks out there that are in the Air Force listening to this, and you're sharing this, you may want to direct folks to episode 20. Once we throw this one down, I think it'll be a pretty good recap, and then it'll allow people to go in and cherry pick the ones that really speak to them from this recap. And so definitely a hockey centric podcast here, but I think it transcends that world and can find itself digging into lots of different areas. So without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to list off the names. And looking back, again, I think it's pretty impressive. Episode 2, Arizona Coyotes, Andrew Ladd. We had him on talking about primarily his foundation, his story, some of the adversities he's faced with injury. We had him on talking about the Ladd Foundation and his efforts to 1616. We'll get more into that. Then moving right along, we had Dr. John Gassaway, U.S. Air Force human performance psychologist with an incredible resume and background working with my brethren there as a fighter pilot and working with some of the headspace stuff that goes into that job, which was really awesome insight with Dr. Gass. Then moving along in November, we had retired NHL goalie and author Corey Hirsch, also TV personality and an Olympian and somebody with one of the most compelling stories I think Curtis and I have ever heard, facing adversity and picking himself up and continuing on there. So then cruising along into January, starting the new year, we had another retired NHL goalie, Al Montoya, prolific college hockey career, and then waited 5-6 years before he got his chance in the NHL and then carved out a pretty solid 7 to 8 year season, 7 to 8 year career playing in the NHL. Now currently working for the Dallas Stars and working their initiatives down there in Dallas. So great story there. Then cruising along, we talked to the owner of the Goalie Guild, Justin Goldman, former E-Bug for the Colorado Avalanche, and a guy that is probably has studied and knows more about goalies and their stories than anybody I think I've ever talked to. So if it's anything that has to do with ice hockey goaltending, Justin is your guy. And so he's got a Lift the Mask initiative that's really awesome as well. And so he was on there. And then in March, we talked to Scott Foster. Anybody that's up on hockey culture and some of the cool stories of what it means to be an e-bug will remember this as recording the first ever 15-minute opportunity for an e-bug and facing 7 shots and making 7 saves. What a really cool story. Lots of fun with that one. But we had Scott on there in March. And then moving into the end of March, Curtis's former goalie partner and current goalie coach for the Tri-City USHL team, but also owner and coach of MHH Goalie Club there, which I always love repping the hat for everybody that knows Zaps. But former pro goalie, made it all the way to the show and then played in Europe for a number of years. And his story, again, hugely compelling and awesome. And then we recapped it just a few days ago with Brandon Williams, somebody that I've known for almost 30 years and have flown with, deployed with, and had a really, really awesome conversation about his efforts with LeadJack, which is teaching companies how to become better leaders and using all those lessons of Air Force officership and flying fighter jets. So as I go back and listen to that list, I kind of step outside myself a little bit. I'm like, that sounds like a pretty cool podcast. And it turns out it's me and you. So Curtis, back to the beginning, man. I remember when we first started talking about this in the summer of 22, I was deeply inspired by bringing my son to a Coyotes game. And I first became aware of Ladder's initiative of 1616. And I kind of had the idea, hey, other than just us talking, what if we bring in guests and we kind of ask them their stories and things that they're doing to deal with these types of things? And you reached out to Ladder and we got him on shortly thereafter. So.
Yeah. And he was fantastic. I mean, that's the beauty of the hockey world is that, I'm fortunate to have played in the NHL and you can reach out to pretty much any of those guys, former teammates, and they're more than willing to connect you. And, I think when you hear anything about Ladder and, you and I both watched his retirement video that I believe was up on or not retirement, it was his 1,000th game. Sorry, yep. My bad. Maybe I'm jumping the gun on that one a little bit. But it was just this, stories from teammates from years past, whether it be Winnipeg, Arizona, the island where he played, and just the way that they spoke about him was just this first-rate individual, right? And I never played with him on a team, but obviously alongside him for a number of years. So to get the opportunity to speak to him, the thing that jumps out to me is, one, the Lad Foundation obviously was started early on in his career and something that him and his wife, Brandy, felt very strongly about doing and finding a way to give back. And now the 1616 initiative, which is what you saw the promo for that night at the Coyotes game. So that's the newest initiative from the Lad Foundation, something that pertains to mental health in the youth realm of sports and in particular hockey at this moment. So it's kind of been cool to see that just pop up here and there. And I know it's starting to kind of roll out. I think October was kind of when things got rolling with teams. So it'll be cool to check back in on it. But I think the thing that jumps out to me more than anything with Andrew is just his willingness and how much he wants to give back to the community that's given so much to him. So obviously he's a family man. Helping out with the youth side of it is very important to him. And so it'll be fun to kind of check in on that and see how it's going here as it continues to evolve.
Absolutely. And giving back in a meaningful way that is kind of there's a hole in how we coach and how we teach our kids. And they found that. And I think it was instrumental in working with his wife too, and looking at their own family and going, okay, him and Brandy sat down and they said, where is this hole? And in the mental aspects of things, some of the stats that came out in that discussion of I think it was over 50% of adult mental health problems become problems, prior to the age of 15 years old, something like that. These things are developed as teens,
Right. And this is just, being proactive about something and trying to really I don't want to say attack it, but to approach it before it becomes an issue, right? Before, maybe medication is getting introduced, before you're having to go to see someone. Maybe there are things and skills and tools that you can develop at a younger age that may be beneficial for all of us long term.
Absolutely. Teaching 10 to 12-year-olds about resilience and how to handle adversity should not be a lesson that they're learning in their teens and 20s. It should be something that they're learning at a young age. And I think the Latch Foundation kind of discovered that. And it's backed by a lot of really, really strong studies and professional work and effort. It isn't just a hockey initiative; it's a psychological initiative, which is cool.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, that was a fun chat. I mean, he was a great guy, and it'll be fun to kind of check in and see where that program's at within a couple of years and just see how much it's grown.
Absolutely. Well, cool. So moving on from July of 22, we have a long stretch there where you and I are jumping into a lot of topics, and then it really leads us to kind of this idea of going, we're talking about a lot of stuff that neither one of us have the credentials to really have an opinion other than through our own stories. And that's what this podcast has always been about, is storytelling. But we thought, why don't we put a little bit of teeth in this fight and get somebody that knows what they're talking about and actually has been trained and educated and has a no kidding doctor title in front of their name. And so we welcomed Dr. Gasaway, and that was an amazing conversation about the bridge from mental health clinical type diagnosis to mental performance, and how to almost treat the mental side of things like a strength and conditioning coach would apply to an athlete, and bridging that gap of, and one of the things that we talked about, and this is a really interesting episode 9, but we talked about everybody really clearly understands when an athlete, and it doesn't matter the level, professional, high school, youth, but when an athlete gets injured, and let's say they have a knee injury, they tear their meniscus, it's obvious that they're going to no longer get to play, and that they have to come off the field, and they have to enter into a medical procedure first, typically, and then some physical therapy, and then some strength and conditioning to get them back to the level that they were at prior to the injury. Everybody sort of understands that progression when it comes to a knee or a shoulder from an orthopedic perspective. You go and address the injury and get it diagnosed. Then you get the injury fixed. Then you rehab it. Then you get to a point where you can train and get back to pre-game condition. Then you get to game condition and you're ready, and you go back and you continue your sport. Sometimes that takes months. Sometimes it can take a year, depending on the level of athlete and the extent of the injury. Why don't we share that same approach when it comes to mental health? And so when people are suffering and a mental health diagnosis shows up, let's say, as an example, we talk about depression. Somebody has some sort of triggering event, or they're chemically dealing with some reason why they have entered a depression for a myriad of reasons that we won't get into, but let's say that diagnosis occurs. Well, it's very difficult even with the stigma today to take that person that has an injury, they have a mental health injury, to treat them, get them help either through medication or through mental therapy, which is physical therapy for the brain, get them to a point where it's no longer a clinical diagnosis, but now they can start to strengthen, and they go and get some continued counseling, and they get some mental performance training. And on the continuum of injury to health to optimized performance, it is exactly the same thing as rehabbing a knee or a shoulder. But yet, it's not, because of people's response externally to somebody going through something like that. And so that's really the crux of a lot of what we talked about with Dr. Gasaway. And it really opened my eyes to kind of go, yeah, this is really easy when you talk about it like this, but yet it's so hard to get people to buy in to that process. And the whole reason I think it's important is because when you're bought into that process, it's super easy to go, you know what? I'm feeling depressed. I'm not at optimal here. And I feel like I need to get myself fixed up. And to get people to a point where they can admit that we've really succeeded in, one, erasing the stigma, but getting people help as far left of explosion as we can.
Yeah, I think that, what jumped out to me with Dr. Gass was just we needed 2 more episodes, or we need 2 more episodes really to bring him back and just continue the conversation. Because I think both you and I left it and we're like, oh my gosh, there's just so much to unpack regarding this, and just continuing to talk about some of these issues that are at hand, ways to kind of take care of them and kind of find your way through things, right? And that's really the big thing, is being able to kind of navigate through all sorts of different situations.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a fantastic conversation. I mean, just a wonderful, wonderful person to have on.
I've talked to him since, and he's given me some additional ideas in some areas. We haven't put the episode together yet, Curtis, but I had a conversation with him about human characteristics that are common among elite performers. And maybe this is a teaser, but we talked about something called the Big Five, and those are things that are common among high-level executives, heads of state, military generals, professional athletes. And so we could probably get into that. And Dr. Gass has admittedly said, yeah, I can get back on another episode with you and talk about those things.
Is that the personality test you made me take? I got to actually divulge all my answers to the questions.
Yeah, well, that was the Myers-Briggs thing, and I promise I haven't shared that anywhere. It's sitting in my phone still. For those of you listening, if you haven't gone online and messed with something called the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, if at the very least it's entertaining, but at the very most it's a really, really awesome glimpse into how you approach kind of life as an individual, and it assesses you across 4 different areas, and then there's like 2 choices in each area. And if you've ever heard somebody refer to themselves as, I am an EFMJT kind of person, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about Myers-Briggs. And so,
all right, well, we're going down that road. We'll give you the details on all the inside intel, I guess, if anything, and maybe if we can get Dr. Gassaway back on, that would be a fun person to kind of help us understand some of the things, the answers and results that we got to all those fun questions.
That would be critical to have him back on with that one, because if we start trying to get too far off the roadmap, I think you and I are going to trip on ourselves.
Yeah, that's likely.
Yeah.
Okay, next guest.
So that's a good one. So moving into November, we Curtis and I, of course, in our never-ending quest of wanting to learn from goalies and having that, we both went out and grabbed copies of Corey Hirsch's book called The Saving My Life. And to put a serious spin on it, I mean, I read parts of that story and wept. I mean, I did. It's a heartbreaking thing to read. Even knowing the result on the other end was a person that put it together and tells his story and is successful. Knowing that story had the ending that it had, and that Corey's still with us, but he talks about how he made an attempt on his life, and talks about dealing with debilitating OCD throughout a career where he is trying to operate at an elite level in an elite sport, playing in the NHL, while basically masking and hiding the fact that he had this issue that was almost driving him to the point of wanting to end his life, or did drive him to that point. So incredibly compelling to try to put yourself in his shoes for even just a moment is intimidating to think about. But we had him on, and when you go back and listen to the episode, to hear his candor and the joking and everything, it was just so uplifting to know that the story has the ending, that he's using his story to try to educate people and help erase the stigma and try to explain to people how important it is to come forward and ask for help. It took him a long time to do that.
Yeah, and obviously just I think the big thing was just mentioning the strength of that individual, Corey in particular, and dealing with what he was going through. And like you said, still being able to function at the highest level of the sport was the most remarkable thing. So just really, really marveling in the strength and courage that he's shown to do what he did, not only in his career, but especially post-career now, and sharing that story and being an advocate for mental health and going around and having conversations and promoting the book, and also being a resource. You know, that's a pretty tall ask. I think the easier thing to do is just to kind of bottle it up. But the fact that he's out there kind of putting himself out there regularly is probably the most impressive part. And, you know, I want to say playing at a professional level, becoming a fighter pilot, these are goals and dreams that you and I had when we were a kid. But I think, you know, as we get older, some of the stuff that I'm starting to do in my second act is something I almost value a little bit more. And, you know, I can't put words in Corey's mouth, but I think what he's doing now and advocating for mental health may be almost more impressive than actually playing in the NHL. And that's not a knock on his career or anything of that nature. It's just saying that he's taking a big risk and he's putting himself out there. And this isn't something that's just gone away. It's still an ongoing issue that he's doing treatment for. So, yeah, he was a phenomenal storyteller. Great to have him on there. Just a big, big personality.
The opening of that episode is classic. And if you haven't listened to it yet, go over there and check that one out. I don't want to spoil it, but it's what you would expect between two retired NHL goalies, and the banter is good. So definitely check that one out. And that one was, episode 11. So from back in November 22. So moving on, we another big personality, another great story. Somebody that I was proud to reach out to and get some feedback from. And we managed to get him on, despite his incredibly busy schedule too, was Al Montoya. So Al came to us. We had a great phone call prior, leading up to the conversation. And then we jumped in and then had an amazing, that one went over an hour. The stories. And again, I think what the big one that jumped out to me on this one is how never to give up on your goal and your dream and believing in yourself. And the most compelling part of Al's story, that anybody that casually looks at Hockey DB and looks at Al Montoya's record and his college time and his American League time, and then jump into the NHL, you may miss this, but what really jumps out is the length of time that a high sixth pick overall in his draft class took to get from college and American League hockey to playing in the NHL. And the fact that he stuck with it, because I know that there are probably a lot of players, I don't have numbers or anything like that, but probably a lot of players that make it so close to the NHL and they're just not willing to make it 4, 5, 6 years of that before they go, you know what, I'm probably not going to make it to the NHL, and they quit. And they move on into their mid to late 20s, and they go into different careers and do other things. And so he didn't. And then, as we already mentioned, carves himself out a 7-8 year career with impressive numbers and stats. And really, it's a testament to his, what makes him tick. Really, really awesome guy. Curtis, what jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we took away from that conversation was Al had talked about some of the injuries that he had experienced in his career in the minors. Obviously, when you're a 6th overall pick to the New York Rangers, there's expectations that you're supposed to be this otherworldly goalie. And, you know, I think we all have different paths and how those things play out. But a lot of times and I'm sure you can attest to this too, some of the best athletes that we played with when we were younger oftentimes don't end up making it, right? Because sometimes you'll run into these walls that we so often discuss, and you're not sure how to get around them because you've never had to face any obstacles before. So Al had a great little run-up, 6th overall pick, tons of expectations. It doesn't really pan out in New York. but he finds a way and he carves out a really nice career. But I think, like I was getting to, was the point was that when he was injured, maybe advocating for himself more and speaking up and saying, I think I need a little more time. This injury doesn't fully feel healed. And, I think that was the biggest takeaway from that interview that we did, was that it's important to speak up. And if you're not 100% and things aren't where they need to be, and that's really a question that only you can answer yourself, that was probably what stood out to me more than anything in talking with Monty.
And having the guts to be able to admit it, not just to yourself, but to people around you, and being willing to suffer the repercussion and not being fearful for what may happen. And so many people are silent because they think through all these situations and all these repercussions, and instead of just throwing caution to the wind and go, you know what, I got to take care of myself, and I got to tell the people that are in charge of the decisions. And that's the crux of what he was talking about. And that's a really compelling piece of that story for sure. Awesome. So moving in, that's January of 20, that episode there, and then we jump into February, bring on Justin Goldman. And as I already mentioned when I talked about Justin earlier in this episode, I have never talked to a person that had so much knowledge. I mean, he is like an encyclopedia of goalies, and I don't just mean like stats. Okay, so I'm sure there are plenty of analytic guys and statistician guys that can run through, all the numbers, but he's a guy that knows the story behind goalies and knows the ups and downs in their careers and kind of the mental side of things, and what his non-traditional background in hockey brought him was this tremendous love and loyalty to the game, but specifically the position of goaltending, that it caused him to be the kind of guy that eats, breathes, and sleeps goaltending. And it really allowed him to sponge all that information as much as he could, from his broadcasting background to his playing hockey background, playing club hockey in college. And then he became kind of a compiler of all this data into books. And so anytime you write a book, you compile information for a book, that is a legacy, and that is information that never leaves the community. So he's done that several times over. Curtis, you've been involved in his books. But then taking it a step further and beginning this Lift the Mask initiative, where we're talking about mental health issues within specifically the goaltending position, and how to optimize the mental side of a game that is such a mental position. Not to say that other positions in hockey are not mentally compelling, but goaltending, with regard to the focus and the pressure and all that, if we don't specifically talk about what those things do to goaltenders, then we're kind of missing the boat, and he's making sure that we don't. So that was the crux of what we talked about, and it was a really, really awesome episode.
Yeah, Justin, to me, when I think of his journey, and as you alluded to, he's an author, he's written some books, he interviewed a host of NHL goalies on what it's like being an NHL goalie. What are some of the hurdles, obstacles that you have to face? And it was geared towards sharing that experience and journey with the youth. I think when I think of Justin, I see someone who is so determined and passionate about something, which is, I mean, you and I both goalies, obviously it's a very unique position. I fell in love with the gear. I'm sure you have your own story. Justin, at a young age, obviously I think the team, he was down in Dallas, right? And yep. The Stars had come down there. It was right when they won their cup. And so he gravitated towards this standalone position of this guardian taking care of the net, and is just so incredibly passionate about the goaltending position. And so he just continues to share stories. The initiative with Lift the Mask is super impressive, something that's only going to continue to grow. I think he has a whole host of people reaching out to him just with questions, and all he's looking to do is to be a resource for mental health in the goaltending world, sure. Right? That is kind of his specialty and where he wants to be. And for me, and watching Justin, it's just all about education That's what he feels strongest about. And it's cool to kind of watch his thing evolve, his story evolve with, the books, the Lift the Mask initiative. He hosts a goalie symposium in Breckenridge in the summer where he brings in all these goalie coaches and just continues to share this knowledge. He's making it an international thing.
He's got a quote in there, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase it because I won't do it justice, but check out the Instagram page or listen to that whole episode. And one of the quotes he throws down in there was just so compelling and has really stuck with me about abandoning dreams and goals. So check that out for sure. Yeah, thanks for that. Moving in, beginning of March, almost pretty close within a couple of weeks of the anniversary of this, the 5-year anniversary of Scott Foster. Being in the throes of being an emergency backup goalie, which is one of those things that you sign up for. Many goalies throughout the country, throughout North America, have signed up to be e-bugs for NHL team. For those of you who don't know that e-bug term, emergency backup goalie. The NHL in professional sports is one of the most unique insofar as the agreement with the players' union and with teams and with management is that they keep 2 goalies on the roster. And if both of those goalies are hurt, who's going to play? Because hockey's one of those games, it's kind of hard to continue an NHL game without a goalie. And if both are hurt, who's going to play? And so you can't hold the rule specifically is I don't think you can have 3 goalies on the payroll or on the roster for that particular evening, and you can't play people that aren't rostered. So the only way to get a goalie in to play in emergency status, i.e. your primary, your starter, and your backup both get hurt, is to sign somebody to to an amateur tryout, a 1-day amateur tryout with the team and step in. And that's not happened to the extent that it did with Scott, where he got to play 15 minutes of NHL hockey for the Chicago Blackhawks in Game 81 of the season in 2018 against playoff-bound Winnipeg Jets. Probably a throwaway game for Chicago, but certainly not for Winnipeg on their way into the playoffs. And he played 15 minutes as a backup to the backup. Stopped all 7 of 7 shots. And so, incredible story here was getting some of the logistics and the ins and outs of that night and that experience. But we also talked about his upbringing. And I don't think I've talked to somebody in that situation that has every reason to brag or every reason to be a blowhard. And he's actually the 100% polar opposite of that. One of the most humble guys, and knew at no point was it about Scott Foster. It was about filling a role and being in a position to do that and just trying to do the best he could given the stress and the pressure that was on him. But it was never about him. And even in his post-game interview, which, to be frank, that was the part that kind of compelled Curtis and I the most to invite him on, was rehashing that over YouTube of listening to his post-game interview. But the words that stick out when I talk about Scott Foster is humble and really a team-minded guy from his college background, and the story that he shared with his college background and kind of the change in him in his college experience, and then getting the opportunity to do that. And so super cool story, one that will go down in hockey lore for a long, long time, is the story of Scott Foster playing for 15 minutes for the Blackhawks.
Yeah, and I still can't wrap my mind around the e-bug
concept.
The concept of it is so bizarre, because when I think of it, and I asked Scott these questions in the interview, was that, okay, when I envision an e-bug, you're essentially up in the stands having a hot dog and a beer, just watching the hockey game, right? No, this is a serious thing. You are dialed in. You're kind of like the backup goalie in a sense that you're watching to see what's happening. If someone gets hurt, oh great, I got to go down and sit in the dressing room, get dressed. I'm now watching the game on TV 20 steps away from being in an NHL game, which Scott ended up appearing in. And it's become a much more common thing. I think we saw it this past season. There's maybe been 2 or 3 for sure. And, obviously a couple of them were throwaways. They were just kind of, hey, let's just toss this kid in and have fun.
No shots faced, things like that. But
and then the way the season wrapped up with Toronto running into cap issues and not being able to make a recall on one of their minor league goalies and just signing E-Bug goalies at one-off games was the most bizarre situation.
Like 2 or 3 games in a row.
Mm-hmm. So it was bizarre, but I mean, Scott was such a classic interview, but then when we got to talk to him for an extended period of time, you realize that was just him. He was such a thoughtful, caring individual. And when he spoke of that group stepping up for him and wanting to make that experience a positive experience, he had nothing but great things to say. So really just a super genuine person, I found.
The best part of that story is when he talks about blocking shots. And he's like, why does that guy have to block a shot from the point? And he goes, because he knows I'm back there. And maybe it's because he felt that he wouldn't be able to make the save. Or maybe he said, you know what? I've got to do the very best I can to prevent this puck from going to the net. I'm going to help him out.
Yeah, he's talking about Hall of Fame players.
Hall of Fame players blocking shots.
In a meaningless game, blocking shots for him. That was cool. I really, really enjoyed that finishing touch to the story. So
I agree. Definitely go and check that one out if you haven't had the opportunity to hear his story. And it's more than what you'll get by trolling the internet and looking on YouTube. We got some unique perspective from him, and I feel really lucky that we were able to pull some of those stories out of him and talk about some of that stuff, because I haven't heard it anywhere else. So I think it was really unique to his appearance here. So forever thankful for that one. That was super cool.
All right, next up.
Yeah, so one fadeaway jumper on Scott's story, by the way. So we kicked that episode out on March 6th. Do you remember what also happened that same night?
Yeah, he was dressing, wasn't it, for the Senators or something?
He was e-bugging again for Chicago, but the Sens went down one goalie, and they actually dressed him. And so he sent us a photo of him wearing a Senators jersey behind the scenes in full gear. Because I asked him, I said, hey, I heard you almost went in pre-game, because they weren't sure they were going to be able to get their backup from Rockford to come up. And I forget his name, but he was able to make it. But I said, hey, how close did you get? Did you get down in the locker room? And he texts me back that photo, and I think we both got it. Texts us back the photo, and he's like, this is how far I got. And it's a picture of him in full gear with a Senators jersey on. And I want
to think if he gets into another game, there should be a standing ovation for that guy, or he should get to take his one more lap, if he actually hangs it up from being an e-bug like they do with all the old Blackhawks.
I mean,
I would.
I mean, it's
that's a pretty legendary type thing.
Legendary to get to appear twice as an e-bug. Now, there's been plenty of NHL goalies in the record books that have only appeared twice, but they have been up through the system, and you know what I mean. So the feat of going from college hockey a number of years ago to e-bugging 2 games, separated by what? That would have been separated by 5 years, which is incredible.
Yeah.
So
that's a long period in between games.
Anyway, moving. So definitely check out that episode. I think you'll, it's awesome. Moving into March 20th. This one's near and dear to you, Curtis, because I know you spent a lot of time with Zabs, both at CC and then working on your current project of the Mountain High Hockey and working with goalies down in Denver. But we brought Zabs on, and we initially had some technical difficulties trying to get him and the episode recorded. So we postponed it and then got back into the deal where we could get him with some good, strong internet, because that was one that we didn't want to miss. And that one went 1 hour and 35, and it was amazing. Unconventional from the beginning, right? I mean, this is a person that played goalie with and made it to the highest level with as little coaching as I've ever heard, other than what he got in Colorado College. I mean, back, not that many years ago, finding a goalie coach and specific goalie dedicated training was hard. And he's an advocate for working with goalies from a mental side, if I can say it that way. I don't want I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I can tell you that if you're looking for a goalie coach that's going to give you all the technical things that you need, probably not Zabs. And he's got sort of an unconventional approach, especially in this day and age where I think the position has become very technical.
I consider him like he's almost like the autopilot of goalie coaches, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
and Dave, you could explain this better than I ever could, but when your jet is on autopilot and it kind of steers slightly off course, he's just there to kind of nudge you slowly back in.
Right.
And it's not, it's not rocket science. He's not harping on anything. He's just slowly guiding you back onto the path in terms of being mentally prepared to play a hockey game consistently. And I think that's where, to me, Zabs' expertise in terms of goalie coaching really shines through in what he's doing today.
And I think it's evident from his background and the stories that he shared with us. It's evident that that's his approach. And I really view it as a holistic way of teaching a goalie. And it's not traditional, but it gets results. And I think he's very successful in that. And then as we got into talking about his pro career and really his experience in Europe, the one big word that jumps out at me, if I was going to try to use single words to describe our guests, if I'm talking about Matt Zava, I'm saying the word loyalty. His experience in Austria, playing professionally over there, and how he left the game as a player, is a story of loyalty that is worth taking the time to listen to it, then listening to it again, and then really reflecting on kind of your own level of loyalty in whatever organization or whatever thing you're a part of, and asking yourself if you have that same level of commitment and drive and desire and connection to the people and to the entity of team that Zabs did in Austria and at Bolzano, playing in Italy as well. Really incredibly compelling. And it speaks to his character as a person, and it's no wonder why you stayed connected with him all these years, Curtis.
Just discussing the differences between the North American mindset of a professional sport versus the European mindset of the professional sports. In regards to hockey, was very eye-opening. I never got the opportunity to play in Europe. Always wanted to. And it sounds like after having listened to Matt talk about that experience, that it would have been something that I thoroughly enjoyed. It almost would have just reinvigorated me because, you are a commodity in North America when you're playing at a high level, and you're only as good as your last game. And if it wasn't very good, then there's a good chance that that organization may be moving on from you in a hurry. We heard that a little bit with Montoya. Any guy that's played professional hockey has probably experienced this to some extent. So, just hearing about that experience over in Europe for Zabs was, it's one of those things, like, he brought all of us, I think, a little bit, put a tear in our eye just thinking about it. You're like, oh, wow, that sounds like the model of what you would want your hockey organization or your company to be like. If you're a business owner, and you can get everyone to buy in and have them feel as strongly about what you're trying to do there as what he felt in Vienna, it was pretty powerful stuff. So, I didn't even know that about him, and that was a fun experience, getting to kind of pull some of those things out from him and hear about it. And, Zabs and I talk pretty much darn every day nowadays. So it was good.
And the fact that he shared it with us pretty openly and didn't really hesitate was awesome. But you said it great, the buy-in, right? The buy-in was evident. He was all in, man. Heart, mind, soul, gut, everything. He was all in. And that's rare. It's rare. And so whether it's, it's a balance of his commitment, but also the organization, or is it, mostly Zabs? Is it, whatever? We could split hairs over the percentages of who's really the cause of that. But the fact is,
I think on some level, we're all looking to belong, right? And if you can find that in your work life, then it put out some good work, right? It's going to be a good place that you want to show up to and do some good stuff.
Absolutely. He's also got a great story in that episode of locker room leadership, which I thought was excellent as well. So certainly worth checking that one out. Their episode episode 18. Finally, we move on to just a few days ago, we're joined by, again, I talked about this already, Brandon Williams, retired F-15E fighter pilot, and currently a major airline pilot, captain for a major airline, but also the owner of a company called LeadTech. Also a college professor. So talk about a person that's got his kind of hands into everything there is Brandon. I've known him a number of years, going on, show my age here, but holy buckets, going on 30 years. I've known him. We were tent mates back in basic training in 1996 at the Air Force Academy. So that's how long I've known Brandon and kept in touch. Been in the same squadron for a couple of years there, but kept in touch with him his whole career. And we reached out to him because what I really was hoping that we could do with Brandon was to get into the nitty-gritty of leadership and some of the work he's doing with businesses and some pretty high-level businesses, if you check out their website, and helping them take some of those lessons that we learn as aviators and incorporate them into business and what that means. And so what really jumped out to me was the level of detail that he gets into as he built the curriculum he now uses to teach companies how to build leaders. And to his point, there are all these human factor things that act as stray voltage in our lives. Things that we call the dirty dozen in the episode, stuff like lack of communication, barriers to leadership, all these kinds of things. And he sums it up into how do we operate in a volatile, in an ambiguous environment and prevent as many human factors problems from creeping into our goals of leading and managing organizations. Specifically, he talks about companies needing to focus on just 2 to 3 things because it's impossible to scope a mission into 15 to 16 different tasks. So he talks about really consolidating that into the most meaningful things that you need, and that should be narrowed into 2 to 3 things. Talks about his experiences flying fighters and overall really, really cool conversation, which gets to the heart of how individuals can impact teams through leadership. And if you start to peel back the lessons that he left us with, you can see in anybody's experience, whether it's in corporate, whatever your job is, in school, in athletics, in the military, whatever, you can see examples of people do this really well, and you can see examples of people that just kind of flounder and don't do these things really well, and learn from both of those opportunities. But really, really in-depth conversation. Another one of those episodes like we had with Dr. Gassaway, where I feel like we could bring Brandon on like 2 to 3 more times and still learn new things. I mean, he gets paid to teach people. So
I'm sensing something here with you Air Force guys.
What's that?
Oh, that we could bring you on multiple episodes and there's so much that you have to share. You know, like the hockey guys are great. They have, they've all got compelling stories and just unbelievable things that have occurred. But, you know, the depth that we can go down with some of the stuff that you have gone through in the Air Force is pretty intense. It's heavy stuff. And there's a lot. There's a ton of depth to it.
There's a lot. It is so, you know, flying fighters in the Air Force is, it's a fire hose effect as you try to learn the trade, because not only do you have to learn all the technical information about the airplane, you have to learn all the tactical information about how to employ that specific airplane. Then you have to learn all the tactical implications of how to operate all the weaponry that the airplane can carry and how it fits into your specific weapon system. Then you peel the onion back and you talk about how the airplane plugs into the bigger picture of the area of operation, specifics of like what is the environment. Then you peel it back further and go, how does my airplane plug into the apparatus that is the operational arm of the U.S. Air Force? Talking about the logistic arm from maintaining, getting the airplanes to the location, servicing them in flight, you know, working with other platforms and working with AWACS and working with all the different sensors. I mean, it honestly, it starts to boggle the brain. And then around all of that is all the leadership stuff required to manage and run a squadron and all the different pieces and parts of managing that, the different jobs and positions. And then all the human factor stuff surrounding and insulating all of that, which is all of these things that go into distraction and how dangerous that can be. Complacency, not maintaining standards, not having integrity, all those kind of things and the implications that can have on the operation. It gets really, really heavy to think about. And there's a reason why at 20 years, most folks that retire from that job will tell you that they wake up one day to look in the mirror and they go, you know what, it's time. That happened to me not long ago, where I woke up and looked in the mirror and I said, it's time to hang it up. I can't do that anymore. For myriad of reasons.
Yeah, I know. When you say it all like that, I think of stopping a puck in the NHL is not that complicated. It sounds pretty easy now, because I don't know if I could fit all that information into my brain that you just talked about. So it's a very much that fire hose effect of just being blasted.
Yep. And it's literally like getting sprayed with a fire hose and trying to drink from it.
Yep.
You look like a dog lapping a hose. It's what it feels like.
What about now, as you're in the tail end of that career? Is it on, do you have that autopilot effect, or are you still taking in information from the fire hose?
I'm still taking it in, because every time I go and fly, I learn something new, and something will light bulb and go, wow. And I've even caught myself a few occasions in the last few weeks that I've flown where I've learned something new and I've gotten more efficient at operating my particular weapon system, where I've gone, okay, I'm going to do that next time because this works better. Doing it this way is easier. Doing it this way is better. Now I know why. And I file it away and I go, I'm going to need that later. And my brain is wired to say, well, if I ever take this jet to combat, or if I ever have to lead in combat, or if I ever need it in this scenario, and I think of all the different ways I can need it. And my brain is wired to think that way. And it is not wired to think that in literally less than 2 months, I'm probably never going to fly the jet again. But I'm filing it away, thinking about how I can use it later. And so I'm
no different than the athlete in that regard. You never really turn that switch off. It's on. It may dim a little bit, but it just goes right back on as soon as you show back up at work. And then all of a sudden, retirement,
right,
and you're flying a plane, but maybe not just at the same speed.
Exactly. And I think, as I've conducted some interviews with some major airlines and got some job offers and thought about the next steps in my career, I don't think the joy of aviation is any less. And talking to Brandon and what he brings to the fight and what he does in his day-to-day, he's just as dialed in, as locked on as he ever was, as I knew him back in 1996, and as I knew him when we were flying together in 2011 and 2012, and now here I am talking to him 10 to 11 years later. He's the same guy. So
nothing replaces that feeling of doing what you two did for a living, what I did for a living. We know we can never replace that, but at the same point, and I'm sure Brandon can attest to this, that second act that's taking place for him right now is something that he's super passionate about, something that brings a ton of value to what he's doing with his life. And I'm sure when we check back in with you in a couple of years and you got all that figured out, we'll be able to say the same thing, right? We'll be better. I know you're going to bring the value, so I'm not worried about you at all.
The thing is I don't, and again, you can see this in athletes, right? One of my favorite things to do is tune in and check out, and by the way, this isn't a jab. You're younger than me, so I'm not jabbing your age by any stretch. But when you watch old timers games, NHL players going out and playing, and sometimes they get these like guys in their 50s and 60s who go out and play. And the one that I really love is watching the goalies, because you see them out there and you just know that their bodies have got to just hurt trying to do that again in their 60s. But you watch them and you're like, I have no doubt that guy played professionally at the highest level, because you can see them in their environment, on their skates, doing their thing. And you're like, you can still see that at one point, and it isn't just because because even when you don't know, you can look and watch a goalie that's 50, 60 years old, or watch a player, period, and go, that guy played at the high level. just by the way he holds himself. And so I think for pilots, talking to Brandon, taking it back, listening to him, he's a few years removed out of a fighter cockpit. But if you talk to him, I mean, talk about a stereotypical fighter pilot, the haircut, the look. I mean, he's got it. Right? So you'll enjoy that conversation. Brandon's an awesome dude, full of energy and a wealth of knowledge. So for sure, tune into that one. That catches us up, right? So that's a recap of all of our guests. And again, I'll say it as I look back. We've been chatting now, summarizing this for about 56 minutes. Pretty darn cool. We've had some awesome people join us on the podcast, but it's been a really awesome experience with you, Curtis.
Yeah, and I think we've got a couple guests coming up here in the next few weeks that are going to bring some really interesting stories to the table. And I think what you and I have both spoken about, just in kind of rehashing all of this, is really some of the things that we weren't quite aware of, that we learned about, and what we're looking forward to most with going forward on this podcast is just that continuing education, talking about those walls within, right? And how certain individuals have dealt with them. And that's the really cool part about it, is that each individual brings their own unique story to the table. Absolutely. And so we get to learn from their story, and we get to hear their side of it, and how they handled that situation, what they could have done better, what were some of the resources that they used in order to get through those scenarios. So that's really the thing that's kind of pushing me forward to, continue on this journey.
Agreed. And everybody's got a story, and it isn't always the perfect billboard or brochure. The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate. It is intended for private, non-commercial use, and the views presented by your hosts or guests do not reflect on any agency, company, or organization that they work for.